The morning air felt cold as Maria Collins hurried her son Ethan to get ready for school. At 32, Maria looked older than her age, with dark circles under her eyes from working two jobs. Their small two-bedroom apartment in the east side of town wasn't much, but she had made it a home for her 10-year-old son. "Don't forget your inhaler, sweetie," Maria reminded Ethan as she packed his lunch. The boy nodded, already used to the daily routine that kept him breathing normally. His respiratory condition required constant medication and treatments that drained their finances month after month. Maria glanced at the stack of bills on the kitchen counter. The red "Final No TIC" stamps seemed to glow brighter each day. She had been hiding her worry from Ethan, but things were getting worse. The experimental treatment that could help him breathe normally cost thousands of dollars that their insurance refused to cover. "Mom, are you okay?" Ethan asked, noticing her staring at the papers. Maria quickly smiled. "Of course, honey. Just thinking about work." She kissed his forehead and handed him his lunch bag. "Mrs. Peterson will pick you up after school today. I have to work late again." What she didn't tell them was that she had cashed another check she knew would bounce. It was the third one this month, but the medicine couldn't wait. She also didn't mention the money she had been taking from the register at the convenience store where she worked nights. Small amounts that she hoped wouldn't be noticed, just enough to cover Ethan's basic medications. The knock on the door came just as they were about to leave for the day. Maria froze, somehow knowing what was coming. Maria Collins. Two police officers stood in the hallway, their faces serious. "We have a warrant for your arrest on charges of check fraud and theft." Ethan's eyes widened in confusion and fear. "Mom." "There must be some mistake," Maria said, her voice shaking as she put her arm around her son's shoulders. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but we need you to come with us." The female officer looked genuinely sorry as she pulled out handcuffs. Neighbors began opening their doors, watching the scene unfold. Mrs. Peterson from apartment 3B rushed over when she saw what was happening. "Ethan, honey, come here," she said, reaching for the boy. "No," Ethan cried, clinging to his mother. "Where are they taking you?" "Mom." Maria knelt down to face her son, tears filling her eyes. The handcuffs felt cold and heavy on her wrists. "It's going to be okay, Ethan. I need to go with these officers to clear up a misunderstanding." "But what about your job? What about my doctor's appointment tomorrow?" Panic made Ethan's breathing quicken, a dangerous sign. "Mrs. Peterson will help you. I'll be back soon, I promise." Maria tried to sound confident, but uncertainty filled her eyes. As the officers led her to the police car, Ethan broke free from Mrs. Peterson and ran after them. "Please don't take my mom. She didn't do anything wrong." The younger officer looked uncomfortable. "Son, you need to stay back." Maria turned to look at Ethan one last time before entering the police car. "Be brave for me, okay? Take your medicine and listen to Mrs. Peterson. I love you." The car door closed, separating mother and son. Through the window, Maria watched Ethan's small figure growing distant as Mrs. Peterson held him back. His face was red from crying, his small hand clutching his inhaler. As the police car pulled away, Maria finally let her own tears fall. She had known this day might come, but nothing had prepared her for the look on her son's face as they took her away. 3 years before her arrest, Maria Collins had a different life. She lived in a small but comfortable house with her husband Jake and their son Ethan. Jake worked hard as a construction worker, and Maria had a part-time job at the local library. Their life wasn't rich, but they were happy and managed to pay their bills on time. Everything changed on a rainy Tuesday in April. Maria was preparing dinner when the phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Jake's boss. "There's been an accident at the site," he said, his voice shaking. Jake fell from the third floor. The ambulance took him to Memorial Hospital. Maria dropped the phone and rushed to grab Ethan from his room. They arrived at the hospital too late. Jake had died on the way there. The doctors said it was quick, that he didn't suffer much. Those words did little to comfort Maria as she held Ethan, who was too young to fully understand that his father would never come home again. The weeks after Jake's death passed in a blur of tears and paperwork. The construction company offered a small settlement that barely covered the funeral expenses. Jake's life insurance policy had lapsed 2 months earlier when they couldn't afford the premium after Ethan had been hospitalized with pneumonia. Just as Maria was trying to rebuild their lives, Ethan began having trouble breathing. The doctors diagnosed him with a rare respiratory condition that required regular treatments and expensive medication. The medical bills piled up quickly. Your insurance will cover the basic treatments, the doctor explained. The new experimental therapy that could really help him isn't approved yet. He mentioned a figure that made Maria's heart sink. She picked up more hours at the library and took a second job at a convenience store working nights. Some nights, she only slept for 3 hours before getting up to take Ethan to school and starting all over again. Mrs. Peterson, their elderly neighbor, often watched Ethan when Maria worked late. "You're running yourself into the ground, dear," she warned one evening. "You need to find another way." But what other way was there? Maria applied for assistance programs, but many had long waiting lists. She sold their car and moved them to the small apartment on the east side of town where rent was cheaper. Still, it wasn't enough. The breaking point came when Ethan had a severe attack that landed him in the emergency room. The doctor was clear. Without better treatment, these episodes would continue and possibly get worse. That night, after putting Ethan to bed with his new medication, Maria sat at the kitchen table staring at a checkbook for an account that was already overdrawn. With shaking hands, she wrote a check for the amount she needed for Ethan's medication, knowing there was no money to cover it. "Just this once," she whispered to herself, "until my next paycheck." But once became twice, then 3 times. She started taking small amounts from the cash register at the convenience store. Each time, she promised herself it would be the last time, that she would find another way. Each time, another medical bill arrived, and she saw no other choice. For almost a year, she managed to stay ahead of suspicion. She kept careful track of how much she had taken, planning to pay it all back someday, but the store owner had noticed the shortages. He installed a hidden camera that caught Maria pocketing $60 one Tuesday night. 3 days later, the police came to their door, and Ethan watched as his only remaining parent was taken away in handcuffs, not understanding that everything his mother had done, she had done for him. The county courthouse stood tall and intimidating in the morning light. Maria Collins sat beside her public defender, Sarah Reeves, a young attorney with kind eyes but an overloaded case schedule. Maria wore her only decent outfit, a navy blue dress she had bought for job interviews, and kept her eyes down as people entered the courtroom. "Remember what we practiced," Sarah whispered, arranging papers on the table. "Answer questions directly. Don't volunteer information. Show remorse but explain your circumstances if asked." Maria nodded, but her attention was fixed on the courtroom door. Finally, Mrs. Peterson appeared, holding Ethan's hand. The boy looked pale and smaller than usual in his too big dress shirt and second-hand tie. When he saw his mother, his face lit up briefly before falling back into worry. "I arranged for him to be here for the opening statements, but he'll need to wait outside during most of the trial," Mrs. Peterson explained as she guided Ethan to a seat in the back row. Judge Samuel Harrington entered the courtroom, and everyone rose. At 62, he had a reputation for being fair but strict, especially with crimes involving theft. His gray hair and stern expression matched the seriousness of his position. "The state versus Maria Collins," he announced, looking over his reading glasses at the defendant. "Charges include check fraud, employee theft, and grand larceny." The prosecutor, a sharp-dressed man named Richard Davis, presented the case against Maria with methodical precision. He showed security footage of Maria taking money from the register at the convenience store. He displayed bounce checks and bank statements that proved she knew the account was empty when she wrote them. The evidence clearly shows that Ms. Collins repeatedly and deliberately stole from her employer and defrauded local businesses, Davis concluded. These were not one-time mistakes but a pattern of criminal behavior. When Sarah's turn came, she approached the jury with medical records and bills in hand. "Yes, Maria Collins took money that wasn't hers," she admitted. "But I ask you to consider why a woman with no criminal history, who worked 2 jobs and volunteered at her son's school, would suddenly turn to crime." Sarah called witnesses who testified to Maria's character. Her former supervisor from the library described her as honest and hardworking. A nurse from Ethan's doctor's office explained the severity of his condition and the high cost of treatment. Throughout it all, Ethan sat quietly in the back row, sometimes using his inhaler when his breathing became labored. Maria tried not to look at him too often, afraid she would break down if she saw the fear in his eyes. On the 3rd day, Maria took the stand. With a shaking voice, she described losing Jake and learning about Ethan's condition. She explained how she had applied for every assistance program available, worked double shifts, and sold most of their possessions before resorting to writing bad checks. I knew it was wrong, she admitted, tears filling her eyes. But when your child can't breathe, and you've tried everything else, I just couldn't watch him suffer. Davis's cross-examination was brutal. Did you think about what would happen to your son if you were caught? Did you consider that your crimes might separate you from him entirely? Maria's voice broke. Every day. But I was more afraid of losing him to his illness than to the system. As the trial progressed, Judge Harrington watched Ethan almost as much as he watched Maria. He noticed how the boy flinched when the prosecutor called his mother a habitual thief. He saw how Ethan's small hand clutched his inhaler tighter during particularly difficult testimony. On the final day, the jury left to deliberate. Maria turned to look at Ethan, trying to memorize his face in case the verdict separated them for years. Ethan gave her a small, brave smile that broke her heart. Whatever happened next, Maria knew the real punishment had already begun. The look of worry on her son's face was more painful than any prison sentence could ever be. The jury deliberated for just over 5 hours. For Maria, each minute felt like an eternity. She sat in a small conference room with Sarah, picking at a sandwich she couldn't eat. What happens to Ethan if? Maria couldn't finish the sentence. Sarah placed her hand over Maria's. Mrs. Peterson has already agreed to care for him temporarily. If the sentence is long, we'll need to discuss other arrangements. Other arrangements meant foster care. The thought made Maria's stomach twist into knots. When they returned to the courtroom, Ethan was already there with Mrs. Peterson. He had dark circles under his eyes that matched his mother's. Maria tried to smile at him, to offer some reassurance, but her face wouldn't cooperate. The jurors filed in, none of them making eye contact with Maria. That was the first bad sign. The second was the way the foreman's hands trembled slightly as he handed the verdict to the bailiff. Judge Harrington accepted the paper and read it silently, his expression giving nothing away. The courtroom was so quiet that Maria could hear the clock ticking on the wall. "Will the defendant please rise?" Judge Harrington said. Maria stood on shaky legs, Sarah rising beside her. In the matter of the state versus Maria Collins, on the count of employee theft, the jury finds the defendant guilty. Maria closed her eyes. On the count of check fraud, the jury finds the defendant guilty. Someone in the back of the courtroom let out a small sob. Maria didn't need to turn around to know it was Mrs. Peterson. On the count of grand larceny, the jury finds the defendant guilty. There it was, guilty on all counts. Maria had expected it, but hearing the words still felt like being punched in the stomach. She forced herself to open her eyes and look at Ethan. His face had gone completely white, and he was gripping his inhaler tightly. "The jury is thanked and excused," Judge Harrington announced. "Sentencing will be held tomorrow morning at 9 a.m. The defendant is remanded to custody until that time." As the court officers approached to take Maria back to the holding cell, Sarah quickly whispered, "I'll visit you tonight. We'll prepare for sentencing. Don't lose hope." Maria hardly heard her. She was looking at Ethan, trying to communicate everything she couldn't say out loud. "I'm sorry. I love you. Be brave." Mrs. Peterson was already pulling Ethan toward the exit, knowing it would be too painful to watch his mother being led away in handcuffs again. But Ethan broke free and ran toward the front of the courtroom. "Mom," he called out, his voice cracking with emotion. A court officer stepped between them. "I'm sorry, son. You can't approach the defendant now." "It's just for a minute," Maria pleaded. "Please." The officer looked to Judge Harrington, who paused, then nodded. Ethan rushed to his mother's side. Maria couldn't hug him with her hands cuffed behind her back, so she knelt down to his level. "Listen to me," she said urgently. "Whatever happens tomorrow, you need to know that everything I did because I love you more than anything in this world." "I know, Mom," Ethan whispered. "The jury got it wrong. You're not a bad person." "No, honey. The jury did their job. I did break the law, but sometimes..." She struggled to find words a 10-year-old could understand. "Sometimes when you love someone, you make choices that have bad consequences, even when your reasons are good." Ethan's breathing was becoming labored. Maria recognized the signs of an oncoming attack. "Your inhaler," she reminded him gently. Take a deep breath. He used the inhaler, his eyes never leaving his mother's face. Mrs. Peterson will take good care of you until I come home, Maria said, trying to keep her voice steady. And I will come home, I promise. When? Ethan asked, the simple question breaking Maria's heart. Before she could answer, the court officer stepped forward. Time's up. As they led Maria away, she turned back one last time. I love you, Ethan. Be strong. The last thing she saw before the door closed behind her was her son's brave attempt at a smile through his tears. Judge Harrington watched the boy carefully, his usual stern expression softening almost imperceptibly as court was adjourned for the day. The morning of the sentencing arrived with gray skies and a light drizzle that matched the mood in courtroom 3. Maria had spent a restless night in her cell, rehearsing what she would say when given the chance to speak. Sarah had warned her that with 3 felony convictions, she could face up to 5 years in prison. We'll ask for leniency, Sarah had explained. But Judge Harrington rarely gives probation for multiple felonies. Maria wore the same navy dress as the day before. A court officer had given her a few minutes to fix her hair, but she still looked pale and exhausted as she was led to her seat. The courtroom was more crowded today. News of the desperate mother case had spread through the small town. Mrs. Peterson entered with Ethan, who clutched a folded piece of paper in his hand. He was using his oxygen tank today, a clear sign that his condition had worsened overnight. The portable tank made a soft hissing sound as he walked. Several people turned to look at the small boy with the tubes in his nose, and whispers rippled through the crowd. Judge Harrington entered, and the room fell silent. Before I pronounce sentence, the judge began, I would like to hear from the victims in this case. The convenience store owner spoke first, describing how Maria's theft had affected his small business. I trusted her, he said bitterly. I even let her adjust her schedule for her son's appointments. Next came representatives from 2 local businesses where Maria had passed bad checks. They were more sympathetic, but still wanted justice. Does the defendant wish to make a statement? Judge Harrington asked when the victims had finished. Maria stood, her handcuffed hands trembling. Your Honor, I know what I did was wrong. I'm not asking you to excuse my crimes. Her voice cracked, but she continued. I only ask that you consider what will happen to my son if I'm sent to prison. His condition requires constant care. Mrs. Peterson is kind to watch him, but she's 72 years old with her own health problems. She took a deep breath. If there's any way I could serve my sentence through house arrest or probation, I would work multiple jobs to pay back everything I stole. I'd accept any conditions. I just don't want my son to lose both his parents before he's even 11 years old. Judge Harrington's expression remained neutral as Maria sat down. He shuffled through the papers before him, reviewing the case details one final time. The courtroom waited in tense silence. Maria Collins, the judge finally said, his voice firm. You have been found guilty of serious crimes that cannot be overlooked. While I understand the difficult circumstances that led to your actions, our legal system cannot function if people feel entitled to break the law when faced with personal hardships. Maria's heart sank. She knew what was coming. Taking into account your lack of prior criminal history, I hereby sentence you to 3 years in the state correctional facility, with possibility of parole after 18 months. A gasp went through the courtroom. Even Sarah looked shocked. She had expected 5 years. But Maria couldn't feel relief. 18 months was still a lifetime to a 10-year-old boy. Ethan would be nearly 12 before she had any chance of coming home. Your Honor, Sarah quickly stood. We request that Ms. Collins be allowed 2 weeks before beginning her sentence to make proper arrangements for her son's care. Judge Harrington shook his head. Request denied. The defendant has been convicted of financial crimes and poses a flight risk. She will begin serving her sentence immediately. As the reality of the sentence sank in, Maria looked at Ethan. Tears streamed down his face as he clutched his paper tighter. Mrs. Peterson had her arm around him, whispering something in his ear. The court officers approached to take Maria away. This was it, the moment she'd be separated from her son for what would feel like forever. But before they could reach her, a small voice called out from the back of the courtroom. Please wait. Ethan had risen from his seat, his oxygen tank beside him. Your Honor, can I please say something? All eyes turned to the small boy with the breathing tubes. Judge Harrington paused. clearly surprised by the interruption. Court protocol didn't allow for such interventions, especially from children. Yet something in the boy's desperate expression made the judge hesitate. "Young man," Judge Harrington said, leaning forward slightly, "this is highly unusual." The courtroom fell silent as all eyes turned to the small boy standing beside his oxygen tank. Judge Harrington's usual strict adherence to court protocol wavered as he looked at Ethan's determined face. "Your Honor," Sarah quickly interjected, "perhaps we could allow the child a brief moment to speak. He is, after all, directly affected by today's decision." Judge Harrington hesitated, then nodded. "Very well. Approach the bench, young man." Mrs. Peterson helped Ethan wheel his oxygen tank forward. He moved slowly down the aisle, his breaths audible in the silent courtroom. Maria watched her son with a mixture of pride and heartbreak. He looked so small approaching the massive judge's bench, the folded paper clutched tightly in his trembling hand. "State your name for the record," Judge Harrington said, his voice gentler than it had been all morning. "Ethan James Collins," the boy replied, his voice barely loud enough to be heard. He took a puff from his inhaler before continuing. "I'm 10 years old. And you have something you wish to say regarding your mother's sentencing." Ethan nodded and unfolded his paper. His hand shook so badly that he dropped it, and the paper fluttered to the floor. A court officer stepped forward to retrieve it, but Ethan shook his head. "It's okay," he said. "I know what I want to say." He looked directly at Judge Harrington, his blue eyes, so much like his mother's, shining with unshed tears. "Your Honor, I know my mom did wrong things. She told me that herself, and she told me she has to be punished because that's the law." Ethan's voice grew steadier as he spoke. "But I want to tell you about the other things she did, the good things that nobody talked about in court." Maria pressed her hand to her mouth, fighting back sobs as her son continued. "When I can't breathe at night, my mom stays up with me, sometimes for the whole night, even when she has to work in the morning. She sits next to my bed and tells me stories about my dad so I won't forget him." Ethan took another puff from his inhaler. The effort of speaking was clearly taxing him, but he pressed on. "When we couldn't afford my medicine, she would skip meals. I'd find out later she told me she already ate, but she didn't. She gave me her food instead." His voice cracked slightly. "She never buys new clothes for herself, but she makes sure I have what I need for school so the other kids won't make fun of me." Several people in the courtroom were openly crying now. Even Richard Davis, the prosecutor, was looking down at his notes, avoiding eye contact with anyone. "The doctor told me I might get better with a special treatment, but it costs a lot of money. That's when Mom started doing the bad things. She was scared I would die like Dad did." Judge Harrington removed his glasses, his stern facade finally cracking as he listened to Ethan. "If you send my mom away, I don't know what will happen to me." Ethan's voice dropped to almost a whisper. "Mrs. Peterson is nice, but she can't carry my oxygen tank when it needs to be refilled. She can't drive me to the hospital when I have an attack in the middle of the night." Ethan reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, tarnished medal. "This was my dad's. He got it for saving someone on his construction job. Mom says brave people do what's right even when it's hard." He placed the medal on the judge's bench. "I think my mom is the bravest person I know. She did the wrong thing, but she did it for the right reason." He looked back at his mother, who was openly weeping now. "Please don't take her away from me. She's all I have left." The courtroom was completely silent except for the soft hiss of Ethan's oxygen tank. Judge Harrington stared at the small medal on his bench, then at the boy who stood bravely before him despite struggling to breathe. "Thank you for your words, Ethan," the judge finally said, his voice noticeably rougher than before. For the first time in his 15 years on the bench, Judge Samuel Harrington was fighting back tears. "Court will recess for 1 hour," he announced suddenly, standing up. Before anyone could react, he added, "Ms. Reeves and Mr. Davis, please join me in my chambers immediately." As the judge left the courtroom, Maria was allowed a brief moment with her son. Unable to hug him with her handcuffs, she leaned down and pressed her forehead against his. "I am so proud of you," she whispered, her tears falling onto his cheeks. "No matter what happens next, I will always be with you." For exactly 1 hour, the courtroom buzzed with whispered conversations. People speculated about what was happening in the judge's chambers. Maria sat quietly, her eyes fixed on Ethan, who had returned to sit with Mrs. Peterson. The boy looked exhausted from his emotional speech, occasionally using his inhaler when his breathing became labored. "What do you think is happening?" Maria whispered to Sarah when the attorney returned to their table. Sarah's expression was guarded but hopeful. Judge Harrington asked a lot of questions about alternative sentencing options. The prosecutor was surprisingly supportive of exploring other possibilities. Before Maria could ask more questions, the bailiff called for everyone to rise as Judge Harrington returned to the courtroom. His face was composed once again, but his eyes were slightly reddened. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat before speaking. "Please be seated," he said. The room fell completely silent as he continued. "In my 15 years on this bench, I have always believed that the law must be applied consistently and without emotion. Justice requires us to follow established guidelines and precedents." Maria's heart sank. This sounded like the beginning of a speech justifying the harsh sentence he had already declared. She glanced at Ethan, trying to memorize every detail of his face before they took her away. However, Judge Harrington continued, "The law also grants judges discretion in extraordinary circumstances." He looked directly at Ethan. "Young man, your words today have reminded this court that behind every case file, there are human beings whose lives will be forever altered by the decisions made in this room." A murmur went through the courtroom as people realized the judge might be reconsidering his sentence. Maria hardly dared to breathe. "Maria Collins, please rise," Judge Harrington said. Maria stood on shaky legs, her hands still cuffed in front of her. "After careful consideration and consultation with both the prosecution and defense, I have decided to modify your sentence." The judge's voice was clear and deliberate. "The 3-year prison term is suspended in favor of the following alternative sentence: 6 months in the county work release program, followed by 5 years of supervised probation." Gasps and whispers filled the courtroom. Maria felt her knees weaken as the judge continued. "During your time in the work release program, you will be allowed to return home each night to care for your son. You'll complete 500 hours of community service at the hospital where your son receives treatment. You will attend financial counseling sessions and make full restitution to the victims of your crimes." Maria couldn't believe what she was hearing. She would be able to stay with Ethan. She wouldn't be going to prison after all. "Your Honor," she managed to say through her tears, "thank you. I don't know what to say." Judge Harrington held up his hand. "I'm not finished, Ms. Collins. There is one more component to your sentence." The courtroom grew quiet again. "During my recess, I contacted the director of the Children's Medical Foundation. They have a program that provides assistance for experimental treatments not covered by standard insurance. I have arranged for Ethan's case to be reviewed by their board next week." At this news, Mrs. Peterson let out a small cry of joy. Ethan looked confused, not fully understanding what the judge was saying. "If accepted, the foundation will cover the costs of the treatment your son needs. This does not excuse your crimes, Ms. Collins, but it addresses the desperate situation that led to them." Judge Harrington leaned forward, his expression serious again. "Let me be very clear. If you violate any condition of your probation, if you fail to make restitution payments, or if you commit any new offense, you will serve the original 3-year prison sentence. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor. I understand completely," Maria said firmly. The judge nodded and picked up the small medal Ethan had placed on his bench earlier. He walked down from the bench, something he rarely did during proceedings, and approached Ethan. "Young man," he said, kneeling slightly to be at eye level with the boy, "I believe this belongs to you." He placed the medal in Ethan's hand. "Your father would be proud of your courage today." A single tear escaped and rolled down Judge Harrington's cheek as he straightened up. "Court is adjourned," he announced, returning to the bench and bringing down his gavel. As the court officers removed Maria's handcuffs, Ethan rushed forward and finally, after what felt like forever, mother and son embraced. 1 year had passed since that emotional day in Judge Harrington's courtroom. The small park across from the county courthouse was bright with spring flowers as Maria Collins sat on a bench watching her son Ethan play with other children. At 11 years old, he looked like a different boy from the pale, oxygen-dependent child who had stood before the judge 12 months ago. "Mom, watch this," Ethan called out as he kicked a soccer ball across the grass. His cheeks were flushed with healthy color, and the oxygen tank that had once been his constant companion was nowhere in sight. Maria smiled and waved, still sometimes unable to believe how much their lives had changed. Her 6 months in the work release program had been challenging but manageable. She had worked at the courthouse during the day, filing paperwork and helping with administrative tasks, then returned home each evening to be with Ethan. The schedule was exhausting, but nothing compared to the fear of being separated from her son. The experimental treatment from the Children's Medical Foundation had worked better than anyone expected. After 3 months, Ethan's breathing had improved significantly. After 6 months, he needed the oxygen tank only at night. Now, 1 year later, his doctor had declared him stable enough to live without supplemental oxygen entirely. "Mrs. Collins," a familiar voice called. Maria turned to see Judge Harrington approaching her bench. Unlike in the courtroom, he was dressed casually in khakis and a button-down shirt. "Judge Harrington," Maria said, standing to greet him. "What a surprise to see you here." The judge smiled. "I have a meeting at the foundation in an hour. Thought I'd enjoy the nice weather first." He gestured to the empty space beside her. "May I?" Maria nodded, and they both sat down. "Ethan looks well," the judge observed, watching the boy run across the grass with his friends. "Thanks to you," Maria said quietly. "If you hadn't connected us with the foundation." Judge Harrington shook his head. "I only opened a door. You're the one who walked through it." He paused. "Your probation officer tells me you've been making all your restitution payments on time." "Yes, my new job at the hospital pays better than the convenience store ever did." After completing her community service hours, the hospital had offered Maria a permanent position in their billing department. The irony wasn't lost on her. She now helped other families navigate the complex world of medical insurance. "I've been meaning to ask," the judge said. "Would you be willing to speak at our next judicial conference? We're discussing alternative sentencing for nonviolent offenders, especially those with dependent children." Maria looked surprised. "You want me to tell my story?" "Your case has already changed how I approach sentencing. Perhaps it could help other judges as well." Before Maria could answer, Ethan ran up to them, slightly out of breath but smiling. "Hi, Judge Harrington," he said, recognizing the man immediately. "Hello, Ethan. You're looking very well." Ethan nodded. "I can run 2 laps around the field now without getting tired." He said this with immense pride. "That's impressive," the judge replied with genuine warmth. "Mom, can I go to the drinking fountain?" Ethan asked. "Of course. Just stay where I can see you," Maria answered. As Ethan jogged away, Judge Harrington turned to Maria. "I don't often get to see the results of my decisions. Most people who come through my courtroom, I never see again. Do you ever regret changing my sentence?" Maria asked. "Not for a moment," the judge replied without hesitation. "Your son's words that day, they reminded me that justice isn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It's about finding the right path forward." They sat in comfortable silence, watching Ethan return from the water fountain. In the distance, Mrs. Peterson was walking slowly toward them, coming to join them for their weekly lunch together. "I'll speak at your conference," Maria decided. "If my story can help even one other family avoid what we went through, it's worth telling." Judge Harrington nodded gratefully. Sometimes the most powerful changes come from the most unexpected moments. He stood as Ethan approached. "Well, I should be going. Good to see you both doing so well." As the judge walked away, Ethan took his place on the bench beside his mother. "He still has my dad's medal, doesn't he?" the boy asked. Maria smiled. "No, sweetheart. He gave it back to you, remember?" "I know," Ethan replied, "but I left it on his desk the next day with a note. I said he should keep it because he did what was right even when it was hard." Ethan looked up at his mother. "Just like you did." Maria wrapped her arm around her son's shoulders, feeling a profound gratitude for second chances, for brave children, and for judges who sometimes let tears fall in their courtrooms.